No prestige, no thanks, and no idea if you'll live to next week. Welcome to life as a plague doctor in 14th century Europe, where your job description includes sticking pointy sticks at buboes, breathing through a bird face, and being everyone's last hope despite having absolutely no clue what you're doing. In the summer of 1348, Yorick Ashford stood at the edge of the Italian port of Genoa, watching as another ship arrived from the east. It wasn't the cargo he was concerned about. It was the crew. Half of them were already dead, the other half sporting suspicious black swellings that looked about as healthy as week-old fish at the market. "Well," Yorick muttered to himself, adjusting his beak-shaped mask, "I suppose this is why they pay me the big florins." No one actually paid plague doctors big florins, or medium florins, or, in many cases, any florins at all. You see, being a plague doctor in the mid-14th century was rather like being asked to mop up the ocean with a handkerchief. Impossible, thankless, and likely to leave you soaking wet and miserable. But someone had to do it, and that someone was usually a desperate second-rate physician, a barber surgeon with more confidence than competence, or a complete fraud who thought a bird mask looked rather dashing. Yorick fell somewhere between the first two categories. He had studied medicine at Padua for almost 2 years before running out of money, which made him practically overqualified. The most recognizable feature of the plague doctor was, of course, the mask. Designed to protect against miasma, the bad air believed to transmit disease. These beaked monstrosities were stuffed with herbs, spices, dried flowers, and occasionally a dash of vinegar. Imagine walking around all day with your face buried in a potpourri sachet during a heat wave while people are dying all around you. Refreshing. "Doctor, doctor, my wife, she has the swellings." A frantic man grabbed Yorick's leather-clad arm, nearly causing him to drop his physician's cane. Yorick sighed behind his mask. The herbs in his beak, lavender, mint, rose petals, and camphor did little to mask the smell of the dying city. Through the glass eye holes he observed the desperate husband. "Has she been vomiting blood?" Yorick asked, his voice muffled. "Yes, and the fever is terrible." "I see. And when did the symptoms begin?" 2 days ago." Yorick nodded solemnly, knowing full well that the woman would likely be dead before sunset. But he couldn't say that. Instead, he did what plague doctors did best, made it up as he went along. "Take me to her." The plague doctor's costume wasn't just a bizarre fashion choice. It was medieval hazmat gear. The full ensemble included a heavy waxed overcoat, leather gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat, all supposedly providing protection against the disease. In reality, it was about as effective as using a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Yorick's leather boots squished through something in the street that he chose not to identify. One of the delightful aspects of plague-ridden cities was the complete breakdown of sanitation. When half the population is dying, garbage collection becomes a low priority. The woman lay on a straw mattress, her skin burning with fever, black buboes swelling from her neck and armpits. Yorick did what any trained medical professional of the 14th century would do. He poked the buboes with a stick. "These must be lanced," he declared with the confidence of someone who had no idea if this would help or harm. The husband nodded eagerly. "Yes, doctor, whatever you think best." Here's where plague doctoring got particularly exciting. Lancing buboes, those swollen lymph nodes filled with infected pus, was basically playing darts with the most contagious substance in Europe. One splash in the wrong direction, and you'd be the next patient. Yorick pulled out his special knife, heated it over a candle, and prepared to puncture the largest bubo on the woman's neck. The room held its breath. He steadied his hand, brought the knife down, and the resulting spray would have impressed even the most enthusiastic fountain designer in Versailles. "Good news," Yorick announced, wiping pus from his leather coat. "The evil humors are flowing freely." The husband looked hopeful. The wife looked like someone who just had her infected lymph node popped like a festival balloon. Neither looked particularly convinced. Plague doctors were expected to perform a wide variety of treatments, none of which actually worked. Bloodletting was a particular favorite, based on the theory that draining bad blood would restore the body's balance. Nothing helps a critically ill patient like making them significantly more anemic. Other popular remedies included applying leeches to buboes, rubbing onions on swellings, and prescribing a healthy dose of theriac, a mixture containing dozens of ingredients including opium, myrrh, and, for that special touch, viper flesh. After prescribing a concoction of ground emeralds, which the family definitely couldn't afford, and suggesting they place a live chicken against the woman's swellings to draw out the poison. The chicken industry boomed during plague years. Yorick made his exit. Outside, a town official approached. "Dr. Ashford, thank heavens. The alderman requires your presence immediately." "Let me guess." Yorick sighed. "He has the plague?" "No. He wishes to discuss your quarantine recommendations for the city." This was another delightful aspect of being a plague doctor. You weren't just responsible for treating patients. You were also expected to advise on public health measures. With absolutely no understanding of germ theory, quarantine recommendations were based on a combination of superstition, guesswork, and whatever seemed to be working in the next town over. The alderman, a portly man who had sequestered himself in his mansion at the first sign of plague, greeted Yorick from across a very large room. "Doctor, what do you recommend we do about this plague? The death toll is rising." Yorick cleared his throat, which was no small feat in a beak mask. "Well, sir, I recommend the usual measures. Burn aromatic woods in the streets. Forbid public gatherings. Quarantine the sick. And perhaps stop bringing in ships from plague-infested ports." "But trade must continue," the alderman protested. "So must living, ideally," Yorick replied. Being caught between medical duty and political pressure was yet another occupational hazard. Plague doctors often served as public health officials who could order quarantines, close businesses, and essentially shut down cities, making them about as popular as the tax collector, but with a funnier hat. By afternoon, Yorick had visited 12 more homes, lanced 27 buboes, recommended 43 different useless treatments, and been spat on twice by people who blamed him for not curing their loved ones. A typical day in the life. Oliva Knott, the only apothecary brave or foolish enough to remain open during the outbreak, greeted Yorick as he entered her shop. "How many today?" she asked, already preparing the herbs he would need for his mask. "Lost count after 20, Yorick replied, removing his beak mask and taking a blessed breath of unfiltered air. His face was red and sweaty, with deep indentations where the mask had pressed against his skin. Plague doctor face, the medieval equivalent of maskin, but with higher stakes. "I've run out of rose petals," Oliva said, "but I have extra wormwood." "Splendid. Nothing says professional healer like smelling like cheap absinthe." Oliva smiled sadly. "Any of your patients surviving?" Yorick's silence was answer enough. That was perhaps the cruelest part of being a plague doctor. Nothing you did actually helped. The mortality rate for bubonic plague hovered around 60%. For pneumonic plague, it was closer to 100%. Imagine spending your days covered in diseased bodily fluids, risking your life, and watching patient after patient die despite your best efforts. It's like being a goalkeeper in a match where the ball is invisible and the goal is the size of the entire field. "I've heard Venice is paying plague doctors the equivalent of a professor's salary," Oliva mentioned as she refilled Yorick's mask. "Plus housing." "Yes, but then I'd have to live in Venice, surrounded by even more plague," Yorick replied. "Although the masks are more ornate there. Very fashionable." Plague doctors were indeed among the first salaried public physicians in many Italian city-states. Venice offered the handsome sum of 120 ducats a year, which sounds generous until you realize you were literally walking through death all day, every day. As evening fell, Yorick made one final house call. The entire family, father, mother, and 3 children, all displayed the telltale signs. Black buboes, high fever, the stench of approaching death. "Is there anything you can do, doctor?" the father asked, his eyes hollow with the knowledge that the question was merely formality. Yorick performed his examinations, administered what comforts he could, and prescribed rest and prayer, the only 2 recommendations that didn't actively make things worse. Outside, he leaned against the wall of the house, the weight of his helplessness heavier than his plague costume. A group of children ran past, singing a popular rhyme. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes. We all fall down. The irony wasn't lost on him. The posies of the flowers and herbs in his mask did nothing to protect against the disease that would make them all fall down. As night descended on the plague-ridden city, Yorick trudged back to his quarters, a small room above a tavern whose patrons were either too drunk or too fatalistic to worry about contagion. He removed his leather coat, his gloves, his boots, and finally, the beaked mask that had become both his symbol and his prison. In the dim light of a single candle, he recorded the day's cases in his journal, a practice recommended by the medical faculty, though for what purpose, he couldn't say. History, perhaps, if anyone survived to read it. A serving girl knocked and entered with his evening meal, leaving it just inside the door. Even she wouldn't come near him, the supposed expert on plague. He didn't blame her. "Any good news, Dr. Ashford?" she asked from the safety of the doorway. Yorick looked up from his journal. "Indeed, I made it through another day without catching the plague myself." "God be praised," she said, making the sign of the cross before quickly departing. This, in the end, was the greatest achievement possible for a plague doctor in 14th century Europe, simply staying alive. Not curing patients, not stopping the spread, just avoiding becoming another corpse on the pile. As Yorick prepared for bed, wondering if tomorrow would be the day he noticed the first bubo on his own body, he reflected on the absurdity of his profession. He had spent years studying the most advanced medical knowledge of his time, which, as it turned out, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot against the plague. The final irony of being a plague doctor? When they inevitably caught the plague themselves, as many did, they received the exact same useless treatments they had been administering to others. Lanced buboes, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers. It was healthcare's earliest version of physician, heal thyself, except they couldn't. Yorick blew out his candle and lay down on his bed, still wearing his linen underclothes in case he needed to dress quickly for an emergency call. "At least the mask scares away the rats," he murmured to himself as he drifted off to sleep, finding comfort in what was perhaps the only actual benefit of the plague doctor's costume. Because when you're walking around 14th century Europe dressed like a medieval nightmare bird, dispensing useless treatments while people die all around you, you have to take the small victories where you can find them, even if it's just frightening the very rats that are spreading the disease you're failing to cure.